Okay. Good afternoon and welcome participants to the third edition of the online workshop on disaster risk reduction, risk-informed governance, finance mechanisms, and innovative solutions for local resilience. My name is Ana Cristina Torlund, and I am a governance and public administration expert at the United Nations Project Office of UNDESA. It is my pleasure to be your moderator for the opening session. This certificate workshop is jointly organized by UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center, UNDRR Global Education and Training Institute, UNDESA DPIDG, through its Project Office on Governance, UNPOG, MCR 2030, and we are grateful for the support of Incheon Metropolitan City and the Ministry of Interior and Safety of MOIS of the Republic of Korea. The aim of this workshop is to equip you with concepts and tools for local level disaster risk reduction and the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. We will introduce handbooks and toolkits for risk-informed governance and innovative technology. The training will offer guidance on leveraging innovative technologies for DRR, improving local finance resilience, and accessing global climate finance. Our goal is to make this workshop as engaging as possible, exchange knowledge and experiences, share best practices, and identify innovative solutions that can help governments and public institutions and other stakeholders navigate the digital era and promote sustainable development. To start the opening session, I invite you to join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speakers. We have the privilege of hearing the welcome remarks from Mr. Byung-Hwa Chung, Director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center in the Republic of Korea. Mr. Chung, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, distinguished speakers and participants. I'm Byung-Hwa Chung, Director of the UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center, one of the co-hosts of this workshop. My participation in this seminar today is meaningful, particularly given this is my first official event since I assumed the post of the Director of the UNITAR Jeju Training Center last week. Thank you so much for the chance to serving the needs of the fellow leaders from Asia Pacific and beyond. First of all, please allow me to warmly welcome all of you this week to our online workshop on disaster risk reduction, risk-informed governance, finance mechanisms, and innovative solutions for local resilience. It's amazing that around 2,700 participants from 157 countries registered to attend this seminar. This shows a high interest of the international community, in particular from the Asia-Pacific region, in the topic of the disaster risk reduction. I also would like to thank two UN agencies as the co-hosts of this seminar, which are UN Project Office on Governance of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office for Northeast Asia and the Global Education and Training Institute for putting together great efforts to organize this capacity development workshop. It's my firm belief that our long-standing partnership and the common efforts to strengthen local resilience should continue to support local actions to prepare for potential disasters. As we gather here today, we are acutely aware of the seriousness of the so-called code red for humanity, when frequency and the intensity of disasters and their devastating impact on our communities and economies have been increasing. Last year alone, it is known that the disasters affected 185 million individuals and the overall economic losses of 270 billion US dollars. Needless to say that the huge impact of disasters is without borders. Therefore, every country and the local communities should work hand in hand to internalize disaster risk reduction planning, governance, and finance in their national and local agenda. In this sense, I humbly hope that our workshop could be of some help to the initiatives we have been taking together to address the overarching challenges of this workshop, which are disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. I believe this three-day virtual workshop will be a very timely and significant platform for all of us to fully recognize the importance of disaster risk reduction activities and to enhance understanding on various measures to mitigate disaster risks and to successfully implement them. As a final note, I would like to express my special thanks to all the speakers and the presenters invited to this event for sharing their great expertise and individual insights, invaluable insights with us. And I appreciate our participants' great interest in this field and sincerely look forward to your successful virtual journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Next, I would like to welcome Mr. Kyu Chang Ko, Head of the United Nations Project Office on Governance, DPIDG UNDESA, to deliver his remarks. Mr. Ko, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, evening, and morning. Mr. Byung-ha Chung, Director, UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of Office, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Distinguished guests and partners, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to this important workshop and to deliver my remarks to begin this three-day online workshop on disaster risk reduction, risk-informed governance, finance mechanisms, and innovative solutions for local resilience. Your participation today and commitment in the days ahead underscores the significant role of risk-informed governance, disaster risk reduction, and innovative finance mechanism for climate action and building local resilience. Located in Incheon, the Republic of Korea, the United Nations Project Office on Governance is part of the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. The principal mission of UNPOG is to strengthen public governance capacities of developing member states in Asia and the Pacific and beyond to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. UNPOG specifically focuses on least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states, and middle-income countries in Asia and the Pacific, and Eastern Africa, as well as countries in similar conditions in other regions around the world. Taking this opportunity, I would like to express my esteemed satisfaction for the continued partnership and collaboration between our three institutions, thus UNPOG UNDESA, UNDRR, ONEA, and GETI, and UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. This continued engagement has resulted in successfully co-organizing 3 training workshops in 2019, 2021, and 2022. As the world emerges and hopefully recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is considered the worst health crisis of modern times, the role of local authorities is at the core of DRR and building resilience. The pandemic and increasing climate crisis have set back progress toward the SDGs and slowed the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda and other global frameworks. Extraordinary efforts are therefore needed to make up for the loss and accelerate progress. The significant role of local governments in addressing the climate crisis and building resilience can't be overemphasized. Public governance and local governance, in particular through national to local governance, coordination, and whole of society approach, is vital for building resilience local communities. It is important to note the climate crisis is compounding threats across the globe, and if left unattended to will create catastrophic damages based on current policies and growth paths. Climate change and disaster risk poses a grave threat to global development and shared prosperity, with each impact expected to intensify even as the world responds to ongoing and emerging crises. The UN Secretary General calls for all sectors of society to mobilize for decades of action, including through innovative solutions, local action by governments and local authorities, and people action across society to push for transformative change. If the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement for Climate Action, and the Sendai Framework for DRR are to be successfully implemented, a more risk-informed governance and innovative approach is required. Accelerating progress on achieving the 2030 Agenda requires countries to effectively tackle multiple risks such as public health emergencies, financial shocks, climate change, weather-related disasters, conflicts, and food security. This requires innovative approaches, timely action, and cooperation across sectors. Nevertheless, weak capacities to anticipate, plan for, and manage the multiplicity of risks and disasters can limit efforts to contain the short-term and long-term disruptions to development. Risk-informed governance can help to reduce risk, avoid, and prepare for emerging risks and building local resilience, because such initiatives will fail unless they are risk-informed. In addition, science, technology, and innovation play a critical role in building local resilience. For instance, innovations, ICTs, and digital technologies are increasingly being used by governments around the world for more context-specific solutions to local programs to deliver essential public services that are efficient, transparency, accountability, and inclusive to leave no one behind. Having timely, high-quality data has become the foundation of resilient and effective government throughout the pandemic. Effective public governance and institutions are essential for addressing the complex and interconnected challenges of climate change and DRR. This requires strong, transparent, and accountable institutions at all levels of society to drive the transformative changes needed to achieve a sustainable and resilient society. the need for strong institutions and good governance has never been more apparent than this time. It is important to channel investment in DRR, climate action, and other measures that can help prevent future crises. This demands strong leadership and corrective action by all governments, businesses, and individuals. This workshop therefore provides a timely and unique platform to discuss and share knowledge on the concepts, tools, and approaches on how to localize and implement international frameworks into local or national context for greater resilience and sustainable development. It will also provide an opportunity for learning about how to leverage digital government tools and data for DRR and resilience. Since 2014, UNPOG has been providing capacity support to member states in strengthening public governance and leveraging digital governance, such as AI, big data, analytics, and robotics, including open government data for DRR and resilience. Over the past years, member states have also requested for more practical knowledge on digital governance, including strategies and innovative technologies for risk-informed planning and decision-making for building resilience. In response to such requests, since July 2019, UNPOG, in cooperation with UNDRR, developed the training toolkit on risk-informed governance and innovative technologies for DRR and resilience, and currently finalizing a handbook on strengthening resilience in cities and local communities through innovation and digital governance. As part of UNPOG's continued support to member states on strengthening capacities on risk-informed governance, innovative technologies, DRR, and resilience, the toolkit, policy briefs, and handbook provides the needed tools, strategies, and approaches on leveraging innovative technologies and risk-informed governance for resilient communities. UNPOG will continue to enhance efforts on strengthening each cooperation by building a continued solid partnership with UNDRR, UNITAR, CIFAL, Jeju, and other related organizations to strengthen capacities of national, local government officials and other stakeholders in fully implementing the 2030 agenda. I strongly believe and hope this workshop will provide a platform for in-depth discussions, knowledge sharing, good practices, peer-to-peer learning, and lessons learned on innovative practices and solutions. UNPOG looks forward to further engaging with you based on the feedback and capacity development request you may want to make for our follow actions. I wish you all a very engaging discussion and a successful workshop. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ko. We were able to listen to you very well. And thank you, Mr. Ko and Mr. Chung, for your inspiring remarks. Our next speaker is Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, ONEA, and GETI, who join us through a pre-record message.
Thank you to the co-organizers for this opportunity to address all of you today. Let me start by introducing UNDRR. So we are the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Our headquarters is in Geneva, in Switzerland, and we have regional offices around the world. And in Incheon, we have what is known as the Global Education and Training Institute, which focuses on building the capacity of civil servants and other stakeholders from around the world. We are also the hub for the Making Cities Resilient 2030 global initiative. So what is the MCR 2030? MCR 2030 is an initiative building on an older Making Cities Resilient campaign, which ran from 2010 to 2020. MCR 2030 started in January of 21 all the way to 2030. And today we have more than 1,520 cities joined with around 430 million urban population represented in the MCR 2030. What the MCR 2030 tries to do is to help cities and local governments. So not restricted to cities only, but other forms of local government can also participate, to help them all achieve higher levels of resilience by following a resilience roadmap. This roadmap has 3 steps: stage A, B, and C. A focusing on advocacy, B focusing on diagnostics, and C focusing on the implementation in different sectors. The MCR 2030 tries to bring together the different sectors, the different departments in a local government, so that they can all work together in the common objective of reducing disaster and climate risks and enhancing resilience. And under the MCR 2030, what we offer as UNDRR is firstly the opportunity to share your experiences with other cities around the world. Also to learn from other cities and local governments from around the world. And to avail of training which we provide on diagnostics, which means trying to understand where you are as far as resilience is concerned, what are the gaps, and what are the actions that you can take to address these gaps. And for this diagnostics, we have a very well-used tool, which is known as the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for Cities, which we will be explaining to you later. So before I close, again, I would like to thank the co-organizers for helping us reach out to all of you. And I would close with a request for all the local governments and cities who have joined this workshop to please take the opportunity to look at the MCR 2030 website to understand how it can help your local government, and to join this MCR 2030 global initiative, so that you can also share your experiences, your learning, your best practices with other cities and local governments around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjaya Bhatia, and all keynote speakers for your insightful remarks. Please join me in giving a round of applause. Now, I invite you all to turn your cameras on. We would like to take a group picture. We are more than 700 participants right now, so please, we will have to have some minutes. Again, please turn your cameras and make a nice smile. My colleagues will do the group picture and they will let me know when it's finished. Thank you.
Wait.
Everybody smile. It takes some time. Sorry. I think we're good.
I think we have several pages to cover.
Yeah, we have more than 718 participants.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Okay, thank you so much, Anhil and Carlit, for all these pages of pictures, and thank you everyone for your nice smiles. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Hyunju Grace Lee, Program Officer at UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center, GITC, who will provide an overview of the workshop. Grace, over to you.
Thank you, Anna, for inviting me to the floor for the program orientation, and I'm sharing the slide now. I would first like to say it's a great pleasure to meet everyone in this 2023 DRR workshop. I'm Hyunju Grace Lee, Program Officer of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, and I'll be your facilitator for the day 3. Today, I'm here for the program orientation. Now, I would like to go over our workshop overview briefly. This capacity development workshop on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation is organized on a yearly basis by UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, UN Project Office on Governance, and UNDRR Global Education and Training Center. This year, the program is focused on disaster risk reduction planning, including Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 and MCR 2030, Risk-Informed Governance and Innovative Technology for DRR, and Finance Mechanism for Local Resilience. By focusing on these objectives, at the end of the workshop, we hope you will have, first, understood the global framework for disaster risk reduction and MCR 2030. Second, strengthen your capacity on governance innovation and risk-informed governance for DRR and resilience. And lastly, improve your knowledge on disaster risk reduction financing mechanisms and tools to facilitate the implementation. Now, I would like to share some statistical information of the participants who have joined the program today. This year, we received a significant number of the registration for the program. About 2,700 participants from 155 countries have joined our program. As you can see in the pie chart, there are large portions in countries such as the Philippines, almost 1/3 of the participants, followed by Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria, Nepal, Cameroon, Bangladesh, and so on. Next, about the gender, we are having gender ratio of 58% male to 42% female. In terms of organization affiliation part, about 47% of participants are from either local, state, or national governments. And you may notice approximately 38% are joining from the academia, NGO, and private sector. Participants from international organizations, UN system, and regional organizations account for around 10%. The workshop will be comprised of a diverse variety of sessions, including lectures, Q&A, quizzes, and other interactive activities. As you can see in the table, there are 3 thematic sessions on separate days. Day 1 will explore understanding disaster risk and planning for resilience and global, national, and local levels. Day 2 on risk-informed sustainable development, accelerating resilience in cities and local communities through digital government innovation. And lastly, day 3 on disaster risk reduction financing mechanisms and tools for local authorities. Each of these thematic sessions will be led and coordinated by one partner organization with support from the others. This time, I would like to present some brief introduction of the organizing institutes. To start with, the UNDRR, Office for Northeast Asia and Global Education and Training Institute, was established in 2010 to develop a new cadre of professionals in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation to build disaster resilient societies. UNDRR ONEA GETI is led by Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, the formal head of the International Recovery Platform. The United Nations Project Office on Governance, as an integral part of the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government, UNDESA, was inaugurated in 2016. Its mandate is to assist member states in fostering effective, innovative, and citizen-centered public governance to translate the SDGs into strategies and programs at the country level. The leadership of the UNPOG rests with Mr. Kyu Chang-ko, the former Vice Minister of the Interior and Safety of the Government of Republic of Korea. The third partner organization is the UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. UNITAR stands for the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. CIFAL Jeju is one of the 30 UNITAR's regional training centers globally, and its mission is to facilitate measurable knowledge and skills for more effective sustainable development at the local level. Ambassador Byung-Hwa Chung, the former Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in New York, is the one who heads this organization. We will now proceed with the housekeeping announcements. We would like to remind you that you need to have your audio muted for the better delivery of all contents we prepared, and kindly ask you to turn your video on so that we can see each other virtually. Please kindly check the attendance for each session using the same name and same address. However, only one entry per day is required. Regardless of attendance checks, your presence in all sessions is requested. Also, your cooperation in renaming Zoom name with your full name and organization affiliation is required. In addition, it would be appreciated if you could actively take part in interactive activities, including quizzes and opinion sharing time. As for the questions, we kindly ask you to write yours in the chat window with your identification, including your name and affiliation, and questions will be addressed after each presentation. Please allow us to provide some more time to explain certificate requirements. In order to issue the certificate of participation, all 3-day attendance plus the completion of pre- and post-workshop knowledge assessments and evaluation are necessary. Attendance will be exclusively checked by the entries to an attendance form, which link will be shared a few times during session in our chat box. Please kindly again reminded to use the same name and email address for all 3 days. These names will be used to issue your certificates. Also, the pre-workshop assessment link was shared through the workshop announcement email sent last week. For those who missed the pre-workshop knowledge assessment, please make up by today. Our colleague will share the link during the session. Also in here, using the same name and same email address is very important. This is the last slide of our orientation. We highly value your personal data and respect your privacy rights. Hence, we acknowledge and respect your decision to depart if you do not agree with the following. Please note that this event will be recorded and the recordings will be posted on the website of UNDRR ONEA GETI, UNDESA DPIDG, UNPOG, and UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. The personal data of participants applying or registering for or participating in this training course is governed by the Data Protection and Privacy Policy of UNITAR. By applying or registering for or participating in this event, the participant acknowledges that he/she/they is aware of the policy and agrees to its terms. The policy document is publicly available in the UNITAR homepage. So this is all from my end for now, and thank you all for listening. Now I would like to give the floor back to Anna. Anna, floor is over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, for sharing the detailed program, housekeeping information, and interesting statistics. Thank you. Let's move to our first session, and I give the floor to Ms. Dasha Moknasheva, Program Management Officer at the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, ONEA, GETI, to conduct the first session. Dasha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Dear participants, warm welcome to you all. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We are very glad to see so many people joining. My name is Daria Moknachova. I work as Program Management Officer at the UNDRR, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and our Office for Northeast Asia and the Global Education and Training Institute, which is based in Incheon in South Korea. So I would like to welcome you to the first session of this workshop. And just a second, I will share my screen with you. All right. So session 1, understanding disaster risk and planning for resilience at global, national, and local levels. This is the first session of our module, and it serves to introduce some of the key concepts, global frameworks, and also approaches to governance related to disaster risk reduction and resilience. And we have several objectives for this first session. The first one is to introduce you to some of the key concepts. The second is to also introduce you to the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative and some of the resources that can help local governments to enhance local resilience. The third one is to introduce some tools for urban resilience planning, including the MCR 2030 Resilience Roadmap, as well as the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for cities, which can help to localize the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And finally, we also hope with this session to promote city-to-city exchange of experience. So, today, this is the session outline. We're already running a little bit behind, but we'll try to make this up. So the session will start with a first presentation by UNDRR, which will focus on the key concepts around disaster risk reduction and resilience. We will have a short break, and after that, we will focus on the presentation of the MCR 2030 initiative and some of the tools for urban resilience. And we will have 2 guest presentations to share the experience of applying the scorecard for disaster risk reduction planning. We will have 2 guest speakers, one from Makati City in the Philippines and another one from Ulsan Metropolitan City in the Republic of Korea. So today the presentations will be made from UNDRR side. We're leading this first session, myself and my colleague Alf Ivar Blickberg, Program Management Officer at UNDRR. And the guest speakers, Ms. Liza Veli Ramos from Makati City and Mr. Yoon Yong-bae from Ulsan Metropolitan City. To remind a few housekeeping items, please make sure to mute your microphones and also make sure to fill the daily attendance sheet that my colleague has shared with you. And we also welcome you, really encourage you to participate very actively in all the activities that will be taking place during the session. And please also do not forget to post all your questions in the chat. So we will begin our session with an introduction to key concepts and issues around disaster risk reduction and resilience, and also some global frameworks. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. Alf Ivar Blickberg, Program Management Officer from UNDRR ONEA GETI. He has over 20 years of experience with international organizations, including the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and the United Nations in the areas of sustainable development, emergency response, and disaster risk reduction. And before joining UNDRR, Mr. Blickberg was Section Chief for Asia and Pacific at OCHA in New York, overseeing emergency operations across the Asia-Pacific region. And prior to that, he also managed the multi-donor trust fund supporting projects in early warning, disaster and climate preparedness at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok. Alf, please, you're very welcome to join us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dasha, and it's such a pleasure to be with you, and great to see the wonderful participation really from all over the world in this workshop. So I will be talking about disaster risk and resilience, and at the end of this presentation, you will be familiar with some key concepts in disaster risk reduction, or DRR, also some key global trends, and also key frameworks, particularly the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So I'm going to now share my screen, and hopefully that works. I hope that you can now see my screen. So I will start talking about some key concepts in disaster risk reduction. So for some of you, this may be knowledge that you already have, but for others it may be new, and it's important to make sure we have a common language, common vocabulary as we talk about disaster risk. One key point to make right away is that disaster risk is a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Now, the hazard, that's the threat, if you like. It could be a volcano, could be drought, could be a typhoon, floods. The list is very long. Exposure, that has to do with whether you are close to being affected by the hazard. So, for example, someone who lives close to a river that floods frequently, they are highly exposed to flooding. The third component is vulnerability. That is whether you are really at risk of being harmed or impacted by a disaster if it happens. And we see generally, and we'll come back to that quite soon, that people who are with low income are maybe particularly vulnerable to disasters. So when we estimate risk, we talk about hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and the combination of those. So we'll go into each of those a bit more with a very simple example. You see on your screen a small hill with a big rock on top. So in this simple example, the hazard, that's the big rock on top of the hill. It could potentially fall down and create a disaster. So in this case, we have the hazard, which is the big rock. We see that at the bottom of the hill, there's a family living there. They are highly exposed to this hazard. If it falls down, they are likely to be harmed. They are very close. So we have a high level of exposure in this example. They are also very vulnerable to that big rock, because if it had been a very small rock, perhaps they couldn't really be impacted by that. But as it's a big rock, their bodies, their lives are likely to be impacted by the rock if it falls. So we see in this simple example, the rock fell and we had a disaster, because we had the hazard, we had the exposure, and also the vulnerability. So there was a high disaster risk. Now, with disaster reduction, with disaster risk reduction, we try to build resilience to all kinds of disasters. In this small example, there's a wall that has been built that you can see on your screen. That's one mitigating measure, but there could be many others. It could be to move the family far away, thus reducing their exposure to the hazard. It could be to build a much stronger and bigger home that could withstand the hazard, in that way reducing their vulnerability. It could be an early warning system, could be all kinds of interventions to reduce the disaster risk. Now, it's important to note that in some cases, we cannot do a lot about the hazard. If the hazard is, say, a volcano, for example, or earthquake, we cannot really change that very much. So often disaster risk reduction is focused on how to reduce exposure and how to reduce vulnerability, and with that, reduce disaster risk. But there are also cases where we can affect the hazard, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So one important takeaway from this is that there isn't really such a thing as a natural disaster, only natural hazards. We talk about disasters in DRR, and we talk about natural hazards. But whether that natural hazard, in our example, it was a rock, but it could be many other hazards, whether that hazard turns into a disaster depends to a large extent on the choices we make as individuals, as communities, about where to live, where to work, how to build, what kind of research and preparations we do. Human behavior and planning can have a big impact as to whether a hazard turns into a disaster, and if it does turn into a disaster, whether it turns into a big one or a small one. As we talked about, risk is the combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and that means also death, a loss, and damage from disasters depend a lot on the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. But there's no such thing as a natural disaster per se, only natural hazards. So let's look at a couple more examples. So on your screen, you see 4 pictures. If we look first in the upper right corner, you see a mountainous region. There we don't really see a hazard, and we don't really see any sort of particular exposure or vulnerability either. There's not much going on in the upper right corner. However, if we look in the upper left corner, we see that there's a hazard. There's a volcanic outbreak taking place. However, there is not a lot of exposure and vulnerability that we can see in the picture. So it's not really a disaster. It's just a hazard unfolding. However, if we look in the bottom left corner, we see that a disaster has happened. There was an earthquake, and there was a high degree of exposure and vulnerability. So the result was a disaster in the bottom left corner. And unfortunately, this happens frequently around the world, as you know. In the final example, in the bottom right corner, you see a high level of vulnerability. It's a typical area that would be seriously impacted by a hazard if it was to take place. It's an urban slum. We don't yet see a hazard in that picture, but it could be flooding, it could be earthquake, could be any number of things, but in many ways it's a disaster waiting to happen. It's a highly vulnerable area, and therefore also an area that would be very key in terms of reducing disaster risk in a community or in a society. I mentioned a few hazards already. It's important to note that some hazards are natural, say a volcano. Others may be human-induced. That could be an oil spill, for example, or sometimes it's a bit of both. There could be human activity that is increasing, for example, the risk of landslide in a particular area. So sometimes they're natural, sometimes human-induced, or they could be both. And there are many types. We have geophysical hazards like earthquake, volcanoes. We have hydrometeorological disasters like typhoons and hurricanes. Environmental hazards that could be, for example, deforestation. Chemical hazards that could be pollution in the air. Biological hazards that could be Ebola or COVID-19. Technological disasters or hazards could be, for example, a nuclear accident. And there are many other hazards as well, all depending on where you live and what's happening in your area. So I'd like you now to just reflect on this for a moment and put in the chat which hazards are the most common in your community where you live. Just to have a couple of examples in the chat. If you can share where you live, what are the most common hazards in a couple of words? So I see a lot of examples coming up there with the flood, typhoons, landslides, earthquake, etc. So thank you very much for all those contributions. Like I see, we have a wide variety of hazards in these workshops. Also, lightning was mentioned, which is indeed an example of a hazard that's taking place in many countries. So thank you all for your examples. We'll move on a bit and talk about some disaster trends that we observe. Sorry, just one moment. So we'll look at some disaster trends and also impact in numbers. I already hinted at one of the trends, and that is that we see the hazards and also climate change do not affect everybody equally, and they never have. Typically, hazards affect the most vulnerable communities and the most vulnerable households the most, and often those with lowest income, and maybe those living at the margins of society. Therefore, also disaster risks tend to exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and other risks. So a number of communities are caught up, as you know, in a sort of negative cycle where they're affected by disaster. They try to recover, but before they are fully recovered, they are affected again by another disaster, which further reduces their ability to cope. And we see that is a pattern both at the sort of household and community level, but also at the country level. So you'll see on your screen some statistics in the bottom right corner. This is comparing countries and their economic losses from disasters. And what we see there is that the high-income countries, they have the largest losses if you count dollars in absolute terms. However, if you look at the disaster losses as a percentage of GDP, you will see that the low-income countries are much more affected. So the low-income countries tend to lose a much bigger share of their income to disasters than high-income countries. High-income countries tend to have built up their resilience more and therefore lose relatively less of a proportion of their income. And that's something we see with families, but also with cities and countries. If we compare the trend over time, if we compare the periods of 1980 to 1999 with 2000 to 2019, we see a couple of things. The number of reported disasters has gone up dramatically. It's almost doubled between these two periods. We see the total deaths was quite stable. Total number of people affected went up somewhat. Economic losses increased a lot. And behind all this, we see that in particular, there is a rapid increase in the number of disasters that have something to do with the climate. And behind all that is climate change, unfortunately. And just to remind you sort of where we are in terms of climate change at the moment. So CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is at its highest level in at least 2 million years. Sea level rise is at its fastest rate in at least 3,000 years. Arctic Sea ice is melting very quickly, has reached its lowest level in at least 1,000 years globally. And also glaciers are retreating rapidly. So all of these are signs that something is happening quite dramatically with the climate around the world. This slide is a bit complicated, but what it's trying to show is that climate change is a key underlying driver of risk and of disaster risk. It is increasing the intensity and also frequency of a number of natural hazards, whether that is drought, storms, flooding, etc., typhoons, etc. But also it is driving more longer-term risk in terms of how the environment is changing, in many cases being degraded. Also how various diseases and pests are spreading, and also species able to spread to new areas, and generally undermining the capacity and capability of communities to cope. So climate change is a huge challenge in terms of disasters, both in the short term, but also in the longer term. And this is not just something that the UN or governments in the public sector is saying. It's also climate change is increasingly a big concern for the private sector. You may be familiar with the World Economic Forum. They have an annual risk report, global risk report, where they're asking business people to rank various risks that they are concerned about. And what we see here when we compare the various editions of this report, it's that the green risks, those that have to do with natural disasters, climate change, extreme weather, are getting more and more concern in the business community as well. There's a change around 2015, 2016, and after that, these are ranked very, very high in terms of risks that are of concern to the business community. In 2021, infectious diseases was a top risk, but apart from that, we see that there's a lot of green fields in your screen. In the latest report on global risk from the World Economic Forum, they've done it a little bit differently, but what you can see on your screen, if you see the column where it says 10 years out, what are the risks that they are most concerned about? Again, you see climate change and natural disasters, loss of biodiversity being the top risks. So it's no longer the case that climate issues is just a concern for the public sector or the NGOs or the UN. It's really increasingly a sort of whole of society concern, and of course requires action by the whole of society as well. So I'll just like you again to put your thoughts in the chat, just in a couple of words. How does climate change affect your community where you live? If you already see an impact where you live. So I see references here to loss of livelihoods, lack of food, increased rainfall, more extreme weather, drought, extreme heat, a whole variety of responses from you. And interesting to note that climate change it's both driving drought and floods, and so more extreme weather in every way. Extreme heat, more poverty is mentioned, and more unpredictable weather. That's an important point. Thank you for that one, because with climate change, what we note as disaster managers is that the past is no longer a sufficient guide to tell us what's going to happen in the future. In many places, you have data and statistics on disasters telling you that, say, every 50 years, there's going to be a very big flood on average, but that statistics, it is no longer able to tell you what the future will bring, because the future will be different. The climate has already changed and is changing already. So it makes things more complex and more unpredictable for everybody. So another key point with disasters is that they of course create emergencies, but they also undermine efforts to build sustainable development. And countries can take many, many years to recover from a disaster. Just to give you an example, in 1995, there was a huge earthquake in Kobe in Japan. Before the earthquake, Kobe was one of the largest or busiest ports in the world. I think it was the 6th biggest port in the world. After the disaster, Kobe never recovered that position. The damage, if you will, or their development, their position was permanently undermined. And we see around the world, whenever there's a large-scale disaster, it really rolls back years of development efforts and changes the path for the country. So it's not just about the emergency phase, but the recovery phase can be extremely long. And I mentioned that the environment is changing, things are becoming more complex. And among the factors that are contributing to that, it's hazards becoming more intense. We see more frequent hazard events, also increased resource scarcity, environmental degradation. Many of you will be familiar with that from your communities. Also around the world, urbanization is driving vulnerability as well, often putting the lowest income people, maybe the marginalized people at high exposure that may live on the most marginal land, maybe along rivers, for example. Also governance challenges, because dealing with climate change and dealing with disasters is very complex. It takes a lot of coordination, a lot of effort, and it's a huge challenge for local governments and also national governments. We see that issues of equity, poverty, and inclusion are also a challenge. Often those who are at highest risk of disasters don't really have a strong voice in society. I mentioned climate change, and then COVID came. COVID has added another layer of complexity to the whole picture in a lot of countries. So altogether, we see that many of these factors interact and create a complex picture of disaster risk that is confronting us. And I think in the disaster community, there is a tendency to deal with one risk and one hazard at a time. We may say we need a strategy for floods, or we may need a strategy for tsunami or a plan for tsunami. That is all good, but there's also sometimes the chance of systemic risks that go beyond one hazard or one community. And what you see on your screen is an example of what we call a multiple breadbasket failure. It's a sort of the cascading effect of various factors that lead to a huge problem of food insecurity. So it starts with a situation of vulnerability, with environmental degradation, income inequality, growing population. There are then some stresses that take place. It could be loss of biodiversity, could be heat waves, could be drought, putting stress on the population and their livelihoods. It then reaches a tipping point. And for a lot of countries, COVID-19 has been a tipping point. It created huge food insecurity around the world. And then with a tipping point in, for example, COVID, you end up in a situation where food insecurity is affected in a country, but also globally. And there could be political destabilization, conflict, migration, etc. So it means that as disaster managers or working on disasters, we cannot just think of one hazard at a time. We also need to think about systemic risks, where one thing can lead to a huge sort of cascading effect and then affect the system as a whole, for example, the food system. And COVID, again, it started as a health issue, but today is affecting all facets and all parts of society. This brings me to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It covers the period of 2015 to 2030. It aims to reduce disaster risk and losses around the world, both in terms of lives and livelihoods. So adopted in 2015, endorsed by the General Assembly of the UN, it has 4 priorities and 7 global targets. Very importantly, it recognized that the state or the government has a primary role to reduce disaster risk, but that it's actually a shared responsibilities across society. And it involves also local government, it involves the private sector, it involves the NGOs. It's really a whole of society approach. And that is quite new, or was quite new, when that recognition, when the framework was endorsed. So just to simplify a bit, what the Sendai framework is trying to do is to reduce mortality, reduce the number of affected people, reduce the economic losses, and also the damage to infrastructure and basic services. While doing that, the framework is also trying to increase the number of countries and cities with DRR strategies. It seeks to increase international cooperation and also increase the access to early warning systems. And of course, early warning systems and international cooperation, DRR strategies, all of these help to reduce the 4 points on the left-hand side of your screen. So it's a whole package that comes together. Key priorities: understand disaster risk, or increase the understanding of disaster risk, to strengthen disaster risk governance, which also Mr. Ko talked about earlier. Increased investment in disaster risk reduction. We know that these investments pay off. If you invest in resilience and is reducing disaster risk before the disaster happens, you will tend to recover or recuperate those investments and more once the event takes place. And finally, to enhance preparedness and to build back better after a disaster has occurred. So to put it in a different way, countries and cities are trying to move from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. On the left-hand side, you see a more traditional approach to dealing with hazards and dealing with disasters. And that traditional approach has been more to respond, wants to wait until the disaster happens and then to respond. Now, emergency response is extremely important. It saves lives every day around the world, but it's not sufficient. So what we're trying to do is to move more to the right-hand side of the screen, to work in a more proactive manner. We will also work while responding to emergencies, also work to reduce risks before disaster happens and to prevent risks from occurring. So most cities and countries are somewhere in between these two circles. But the Sendai framework and the approach that the framework is promoting is to move more towards a disaster risk management approach on the right-hand side of the screen. And we can never reduce risk to zero. There is risk involved with just being on this planet. But so we have to live with some uncertainty and some risk. But the idea is to reduce it by working on prevention, working on reducing exposure and vulnerability before a hazard occurs and before disaster then happens. And finally, this is just a way to show that there's a lot happening at the same time that is interconnected in our world. So you'll be familiar with the Paris Agreement on climate change. You'll know about the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. I've talked about the Sendai framework. There's also the Agenda for Humanity on the humanitarian front. There's the new urban agenda. It has to do with urban development and urban resilience. And an Addis Ababa action agenda on financing for sustainable development. But all of these are really coming together and trying to promote risk-informed sustainable development. And without action on climate, without action on disaster risk, it will be nearly impossible to achieve sustainable development. So we have to move forward on all these fronts to achieve sustainable development. That is the thinking behind this various framework. So this is just a list of key resources. I think you will get a copy of this presentation as part of the documents for this training. So you'll have an opportunity to look at the resources and go through this in more detail. But with this, I reached the end of the presentation and handing back to you, Dasha, and also open to questions and comments from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al, for this very informative presentation. I see there was very active participation from our audience in the chat. There are quite a few questions as well. So we'll take a few minutes now to take them. I'll try to group them for you. So some of the questions focus more on the concepts around disaster risk reduction, resilience, vulnerability. Would you prefer to take them one by one, or should I?
If you can group them, that is great. Those that were posted while I was talking, I probably missed some of them, but
sure.
If you can pull out some, that would be excellent.
Absolutely. So one of the very interesting questions that I see is, if there is no exposure to hazards, does it mean that there will be no vulnerability? I think it's a very good one that absolutely needs to be clarified. Then there are a few questions more about how to address vulnerability. And strategies also for disaster risk reduction. So one question came from Somalia in the context of drought risks. What strategies can be used to lessen the escalating and intensifying drought risks? And another one focused more on the context of earthquakes, on what can be done to address vulnerability in the context of earthquakes. And a slightly separate one, but still related to the theoretical conceptual links between different concepts is how is DRR linked with sustainable development goals? So maybe we can start with this group of questions and then I'll...
Yeah, okay. That is great. So I'll start with the first you mentioned, that if there's no exposure, does it mean that there's no vulnerability? And the answer to that is no. You may well have a situation where there is no exposure, but still a high vulnerability. But then that vulnerability is less important. I can take an example. So you could say that sitting here in Sendai, I may be very vulnerable to a volcanic outbreak, but I'm not exposed to it. There is no volcano nearby. So there's very low or zero exposure to the volcanic eruption here. So in many cases, you may be vulnerable to a whole set of hazards, but you're only exposed to a couple of them, thankfully, or to a few of them. So definitely you can have situations of low exposure and high vulnerability. You can also have situations where you are highly exposed to hazard, but you're not particularly vulnerable. So for example, in Japan, to take Japan as an example, they are highly exposed to earthquakes, for example, but they have worked very, very hard on making sure that their infrastructure, their homes, their systems are resilient to earthquakes, and in that way reduce their vulnerability to earthquakes. So these two concepts of exposure and vulnerability does not depend on each other. So in terms of how to address vulnerability, it really depends on the situation. In some cases, poverty reduction can be an important way to reduce vulnerability. In other cases, it could be to invest in resilient infrastructure, for example, to make sure that building codes are respected. It could be to have good land use, for example. So it could also be to have a good early warning system. All of these efforts could help to address vulnerability, but we see that in many societies, vulnerability correlates, if you will, with poverty. So efforts to reduce poverty could also have an important impact on vulnerability to disasters. There was a question about how to lessen drought risk. Now, there may be colleagues on this call who are a lot more exposed and familiar with drought than me, but what we've seen in countries that have sort of successfully dealt with drought, early warning, sort of monitoring early warning is extremely important in these cases. So these days you can even monitor drought risk from space through satellite imagery, but to get early warning of coming drought is extremely important, also for people to be able to switch to more drought-resistant crop, for example, or take other measures to protect themselves before the drought comes. So that's just one example of that, to help people and communities switch to more drought-resistant crops. But also early warning in these cases would help to alert sort of disaster managers and disaster responders to an oncoming drought, help them pre-position food, pre-position water, medical help, etc. There was a question about earthquake. What can be done to address vulnerability to earthquake? And I may have talked about that a bit already, but partly it has to do with to build resilience in terms of infrastructure, housing, but also to educate the people, to educate people ahead of disaster what to do in an event that an earthquake comes. It's also extremely important to prevent the loss of life. We see that making sure that building codes are respected is another key issue. But when it comes to earthquake, you cannot reduce the risk to zero, but a lot that can be done to build resilience ahead of the earthquake occurring. Finally, how DRR is linked with the SDGs. Actually, some of the indicators for the Sendai framework are also indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. So the reduction of the risk of disasters is sort of built into the Sustainable Development Goals as well. But the idea is that if you are looking for sort of an increase or a reduction in poverty globally, that will be very difficult to achieve unless disasters like drought, for example, or floods are tackled. Because when disasters happen, they put a country and a society as a huge setback for their development. So reducing the risk to disaster is really an enabler for the sustainable development to take place. So whether it comes to health, education, reduction of poverty, and other sustainable development goals, in many cases, they are being undermined by disasters, and good disaster risk reduction can enable progress on these priorities. So I hope that helped clarify a bit, and it's wonderful to see all the questions and comments being made in the chat. So back to you, Dasha.
Thank you, Alf. We have so many comments and questions coming up. I'm afraid it might be a bit difficult to answer all of them, but maybe another round. So one question is more about the slides you were showing towards the middle of changing the way that the system works and moving from a reactive system to a preventive one. So some of the questions are actually, how can we move from this reactive to a more forward-looking way of governing risk? Also, this is maybe more of a rhetorical question. Don't you think that looking at current situation and cascading risks requires a more multidisciplinary risk planning and management, and also breaking silos and using multi-hazard approaches? Some questions were, how can a better understanding of disaster risk and resilience help communities and governments prepare for and mitigate the impacts of natural and human-induced disasters? So I think this set of questions is more about how do we change the status quo and move to a more prevention-oriented approaches. Let's stop with this one now, and then we'll have a third round to close.
Okay. Thank you. And I think some of this will also cover throughout this workshop over 3 days. But in terms of how to move to a more forward-looking system, a more forward-looking approach, I think it's very important for governments, whether it's sort of local or national, to work as a convener and to set the tone in terms of planning for the future. So to pull together a wide range of stakeholders to build not just contingency plans, but also plans for how to work together to reduce disaster risk over time. So I think the initiatives would often come from government, on the government side, but it's important to note that we are not saying that you should stop responding to ongoing emergencies, because that will always be needed. But it's beyond that. We want to change the approach to a more forward-looking one. So I think part of the answer to the first question is actually included in the second question about the multidisciplinary approach, and also a sort of breaking silos, bringing many stakeholders together. It's also a question of making the case, because we know that in terms of resources, whether it's the resources from donors or resources within a government, it's usually easier to attract funding to a disaster that is there already, that's unfolding, that's already had a big impact. Can often be harder to mobilize resources for something that you're trying to prevent from happening in the first place. And I think that is the challenge for a lot of people and a lot of actors in disaster risk reduction, that we are trying to mobilize resources and to sort of marshal a lot of engagement to prevent something from happening. And that means we have to constantly advocate for the fact that disaster risk reduction works, that lives are being saved, disasters are being prevented, and impact of disaster is being reduced by interventions in disaster risk reduction. So part of achieving that, I would say, is also advocacy. It's about sharing good practice, sharing ideas and examples of what works, what has worked, what has helped save lives, save livelihoods in countries that have been exposed to hazards and disasters. So a community like this in the workshop can also be helpful in that we share, I would say, ideas, we share good practices with each other, which enables us to be good advocates within our respective organizations, whether that is a city government, national government, NGOs, businesses, or others. But I think that there's no particular finishing line in terms of arriving at this more sort of forward-looking approach. It's a constant process of pushing forward and pushing towards a more preventive approach. I think the final question was about how better understanding of risk can lead to a reduction of risk or to better action. And I think generally it means that the more you know, say, about earthquake risk or typhoon risk, the more you can, first of all, you can educate people about what is happening. You can educate people about what to do to prepare themselves, prepare their families and their communities. And we've seen actually that working on disaster risk reduction and educating kids in schools here in South Korea, for example, has been very effective to teach them about what to do in the case of a disaster. So the more research that is taking place, the more better we understand the hazard and understand the risk. I think generally the earlier people will be able to act, and the more able they will be also to save lives and save livelihoods. So therefore also there's a lot of research going into understanding risk and also mapping risk to find out where are we most at risk, who is most at risk, and what could be the potential impact. So over to you, Daria.
Thank you so much, Alf. I think these are brilliant answers that also address some of the other comments and questions that came up, including how to ensure that these global frameworks are more understood and implemented at grassroots level, and how to also ensure coordination, ensure that no one is left behind. So thank you very much for your insights. And maybe one last round of questions, which all revolve about the Sendai framework implementation, because this year, 2023, is a very important year where we're halfway through the implementation process, and there is an important midterm review going on this year. So one of the questions was, what is the progress made on the 7 targets of the Sendai framework? And another one, whether we could foresee any changes in these initial targets that were defined after the midterm review. And finally, what can we expect from the Sendai framework midterm review? And I think we'll close with that. Thank you, Alf.
Okay. Thank you. And this reminds me that actually there's going to be an event in May for the midterm review of the Sendai framework. And there's also a report that is just being released now on the progress. If I were to summarize that, I don't think there are any changes in the targets that's being expected at the moment. But sort of global, of course, there's a mixed picture if you look community by community or country by country, but globally, countries are doing quite well in terms of developing disaster risk reduction strategies at various levels. Also in terms of saving lives, actually reducing mortality, it's quite a bit of progress. However, when it comes to reducing economic losses, we're not doing so well. And also when it comes to protecting infrastructure and a couple of other priorities. So it's really a mixed picture. And I would say if we were to summarize it in one or two sentences, we're still playing catch up. Overall, while we are trying to implement the Sendai framework, the climate and the environment is changing at the same time. Saving lives, a lot of lives are being saved by early warning systems and better investments in response capacity and better planning. However, we see that there's a huge economic impact still from disasters and a lot of work to be done. So depending on your perspective, the glass may be half full or half empty, but we can make that report or the summary of the report available, I think, for this workshop. So you can all read through sort of target by target and see how we're doing globally and think through how you're doing in your community as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alf. Unfortunately, we're getting very much behind our schedule, so very unfortunately, we will not be able to take any additional questions at this point. However, I would like to remind you that this is a 3-day workshop, so we will be able to address other questions, in particular those related to the links with climate change adaptation in the other sessions, and we will have a few more examples also of disaster risk reduction action from different countries later today and in the coming sessions. So thank you very much for your understanding and very active participation. It was really great to see so many questions coming up. To finish this this particular segment of session 1, we will share with you all these additional resources through the link that my colleagues have provided in the chat. There are some very useful publications that you can read to better understand the concepts, the links, also possible examples of action that has been undertaken by different countries and cities worldwide. So all of this will be shared with you. And now I would like to invite you to take a 5-minute break. Please return by 3:35 Korean Standard Time. And we will move on to the next part of the session. Thank you very much again for your attention so far, and see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I hope that everyone is back now from the break. Apologies for having shortened it that much, but we're trying to catch up on the time that we lost a little bit at the beginning. So in this second part of the session, we will focus on making a brief overview of the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. And I will also present a few tools that can be used for urban resilience planning. So let me just check with colleagues if the session is being recorded. If you could please make sure that it is. Okay. So let us start now with the Making Cities Resilient 2030 initiative. Just a second. There. So in this presentation, I will make a brief introduction to the MCR 2030. I will also present one of the tools that we recommend for urban resilience planning at the local level, which is the disaster resilience scorecard for cities. And we will also do a simple exercise to try to practice using that, that tool. So first of all, the MCR 2030 initiative was launched in 2021, and it offers a unique cross-stakeholder initiative that helps to improve local resilience, focusing on advocacy, sharing knowledge and experiences between cities, reinforcing city-to-city learning networks, providing technical expertise, and also connecting different levels of government and supporting partnerships to help cities become more resilient in the face of disasters. The MCR 2030 is building on a previous campaign, which lasted from 2010 to 2020, which focused more on advocacy and trying to bring together local governments around the understanding of risk and also the understanding of the need for action to strengthen resilience of cities. So in 2020, the campaign closed and we moved into a decade of action. So we moved from advocacy to implementation with the creation of the MCR 2030 initiative. And by doing so, this initiative really tries to directly contribute to the achievement of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction at the local level, and also the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and in particular Sustainable Development Goal 11, which focuses on city resilience, and also to contribute to the Paris Agreement and New Urban Agenda. So compared with the campaign, the MCR 2030 initiative, which will take place for the next 10 years, offers a clear resilience roadmap and global partnerships and tools to help cities become more resilient. So under one single umbrella, it really brings together all these tools and partners and services which are available through the MCR website and dashboard. The MCR 2030 initiative has three strategic objectives. It aims to help cities to know better, so better understand risk. Secondly, to plan better, so to develop local strategies and plans to enhance resilience. And thirdly, to implement better, to build the capacity of cities to better implement the strategies and plans that they have developed. And there is also a set of cross-cutting objectives which aim to promote horizontal and vertical links and governance coherence, and also to promote city-to-city exchange. And this last point, the city-to-city exchange, is really key because based on the campaign, we also noted some key learnings and understood that cities have a lot of expertise that can be shared between them and that can really help different local governments to advance on their resilience pathway. And all the MCR 2030 partners provide services along all of these strategic objectives and cross-cutting objectives as well. So what does the MCR 2030 approach involve? It is built around a three-stage resilience roadmap, as we call it, that really aims to guide cities on how to improve coherence, how to improve resilience over time, starting from better understanding of risk and resilience. And this is what we call stage A cities that have committed to starting to develop and implement DRR and consider risks. The second stage is stage B, which focuses on improved planning. And the third stage is stage C, which focuses on implementation. So as part of this initiative, cities can take a very simple assessment to identify where they currently stand on this resilience roadmap. And based on that, they can make commitments to progress further along the roadmap. And at every stage, cities can gain access to a range of tools and technical advisory inputs delivered by different partners according to the stage and to the needs of the city. So you can see at the bottom of this graph, there are all the types of tools and areas of expertise that are provided by MCR 2030 partners, and they are grouped into 12 thematic areas which correspond to the different stages of the MCR 2030. And by grouping these different tools into these categories, this helps cities to better be able to find the resources that are correspond to their needs. And in a nutshell, basically what MCR 2030 aims to provide is, first of all, to help cities to understand where they are on this resilience roadmap, and also they can demonstrate some commitments to progress and become more resilient. Secondly, it is to help partners to provide resources, contacts, and tools that are appropriate to each city stage in this journey. And thirdly, the aim is also to promote collaboration between cities and between different partners to help cities progress along this resilience journey. And the resilience roadmap is very flexible, so cities can join the MCR 2030 at any stage. They can join at stage C if they are already very advanced. They do not have to go through stage A and B already because they've already done the work. And really the value of being part of the MCR 2030 is this access to the tools and services and partners, and also the opportunity to share knowledge and experience between different cities globally. So for each stage of the resilience journey or the roadmap, there are specific steps or critical milestones that cities are required to reach in order to move on to the next stage. And by breaking down the resilience roadmap into these very clear steps, the MCR 2030 helps cities to assess and make progress on their resilience journey. So cities are encouraged to demonstrate this progress through the MCR 2030 dashboard, and they can highlight all the key actions that they have implemented, all the success that they have achieved, and also share insights through the dashboard with other cities on how they have completed these steps. The MCR 2030 brings together key global urban resilience actors, including our core co-funding partners such as ICLEI, UN agencies, World Bank, IFRC, UCLG. They all co-own and co-deliver the MCR 2030 together, and they provide the technical knowledge and other resources that are necessary for cities for their disaster risk reduction and resilience needs. And for example, UNDRR's role in this process is, as a core partner, is to provide support to cities, especially in stage A and B, related to awareness raising, understanding risks, and also planning for resilience. And UNDRR also acts as the global secretariat and coordinates and promotes collaborations between the different partners and cities, including through the dashboard. And finally, the MCR 2030 also brings together NGOs, academia, and the private sector that can contribute with their expertise in the areas of risk assessment, technologies, innovative finance mechanisms, and many others. In addition, MCR 2030 also encourages the participation of national governments and associations of municipalities. They can all join the MCR 2030 to help enhance the collaboration and the vertical links between national government and local government. National governments can support, for example, cities in developing their DR and climate change adaptation plans. So it's very important for different ministries to engage. And national associations of municipalities can also play a key role in convening different cities and supporting them in really scaling up resilience. So where we stand now, at the moment, there are over 1,500 cities that have joined the MCR 2030 since its launch in January 2021. And this means that there's a population of over 475 million people that is covered, residing in the participating cities. There's also 21 resilience hubs, which are cities that demonstrate particularly advanced practices and innovative approaches in terms of disaster risk reduction and resilience. And these are cities that have committed to set an example and promote city-to-city and peer-to-peer exchange and to help other cities on their resilience journey. And globally, all these cities actively engage in the initiative. They progress on their resilience roadmap that they have defined individually. They continue to share their experience with others, learning from each other. So there are many events that are organized regionally and globally by different MCR 2030 members and partners. And these include national, regional, and international seminars, dialogues, and then trainings. And there are many resources also and opportunities for learning and exchange that are made available through the participation in the MCR 2030. So one of the key tools as part of this initiative is the dashboard, which is a closed online platform that can be used by cities to interact with each other and also access participating entities and their services. So it allows cities to record and monitor their progress along the resilience roadmap. And they can also share insights and lessons learned with other cities. And they can identify useful services that are provided by participating entities. So there are two types of MCR 2030 dashboard users. The local government, so each city can create a profile for the city. And there are also participating entities, and this is where, for example, national governments can join, or the private sector, or consultancy firms that provide services to cities. And here I would like to list a few examples of services that are available for MCR 2030 cities through the dashboard. So they are, as I mentioned before, all categorized by stage and type of services that cities might be looking depending on where they are in the resilience journey. So here you see some examples of tools that can contribute to raising awareness on disaster risk reduction and resilience. There are also tools specifically for stage B cities, which aim to help improve risk analysis, risk assessment, and also help to develop resilience action plans and strategies. And for stage C cities that are moving on to implementation, there are also services provided by different partners that can help to develop bankable projects, for example, or identify relevant sources of finance. And joining MCR 2030 is a very easy process for cities. So each city has to commit at the highest level. So usually a letter of commitment from the mayor is necessary in order to join the MCR 2030. And there are numerous guides that are available on the dashboard that you can access to understand how to join the initiative and how to create an account. So I would like to invite you to have a look at these links and consider for your city to join as well, or if you're participating, if you're a partner, you can also join to list your services that you can provide to cities. Now, moving on to one of the important tools that we have that can support cities in their urban resilience planning. It's the Disaster Resilience Scorecard for cities. And it is an excellent and very simple tool for disaster resilience planning, which offers a set of assessments that can help cities to assess their disaster resilience levels across different sectors and different levels of governance. And it should be used as part of an inclusive and consultative process led by local government authorities, involving multiple stakeholders to promote dialogue and really ensure greater resilience and more integrated approaches at the city level. And the scorecard is one element of an overall approach of building resilience. And resilience building is really a long-term process, which can take several decades sometimes, and it involves many stages. So here is a very simplified graph showing these different stages, starting from understanding the risks that your city is facing, and continuing on to planning and implementation. And so the MCR 2030 Resilience Roadmap builds on this overall approach. And there are a number of tools that are available for national and city governments that can help them in this process. And the scorecard is one of them. One of the key elements also in this overall approach is the 10 essentials. The 10 essentials is a checklist that serves to guide local level action, and it unpacks the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, breaks it down into what it means actually to implement the Sendai framework at the local level. So the 10 essentials cover all aspects of disaster risk reduction, from governance to preparedness to response and recovery. And they are really the 10 fundamental areas of work that cities need to engage in to strengthen their resilience. So they should be considered as guiding principles for local level disaster risk reduction. And they can also constitute the basis for developing city resilience plans. So they are the key element of the MCR 2030 approach and tools. And the scorecard is based on these 10 essentials, and it further unpacks what it means to be resilient across all levels of city governance. And what it does is that it helps to identify gaps and develop plans to address these gaps. And this is what we call a resilience plan. There are different types of scorecards. There's the preliminary scorecard that includes 47 indicators, which are based on the 10 essentials, and these can be applied in a 1 or 2 day workshop to conduct an initial assessment. There's also a detailed scorecard, which contributes to a more in-depth assessment through 117 indicators. And this can be done as part of a much longer process that can take sometimes up to several months, and which can really form the basis for a detailed city resilience action plan. And the scorecard is available in different formats. There's the PDF version, the Excel, and it is now also available online. And this online version actually also helps to record actions related to the identified gaps, and also to share the profile more easily with other city stakeholders. Today, I will just demonstrate briefly what the Excel tool looks like for the preliminary level assessment. And so when you can download all these tools from the MCR 2030 and the UNDRR websites, and the links are provided. So when you download the Excel tool, you get to this page. And you can see here, actually, can I show? Yes. Here you have all the 10 essentials that you can click in order to access a specific essential. And you also have the menu at the top, which allows you to start from Essential 1 or here through the button Go. You can also go to the results page once you have completed the survey, the indicators for each of the essentials. And there's also a button to reset all data, which is best not to press unless you really want to delete all the results. When you click, for example, on Essential 1, you will get to a set of questions which are based on the 10 essentials, and where you can see there's a different score for each question. So here's an example of one indicator under Essential 1, which focuses on organizing for disaster resilience. And this specific question is about city master plans and whether they include disaster risk reduction considerations and are aligned with the standard framework. So a city planners can work together to score, to identify what is the score of their city according to these different questions. So the maximum score is 3 if a DR plan is fully integrated, and the minimum score is 0 if there are no plans at the city level. So this is just one example out of the 47 indicators that are available in the scorecard. And when you open the Excel tool, this is what you see. This is how the page for Essential 1 looks, for example. So you have the question that appears at the top of the page, the response that you can rate. And so we recommend that based on a discussion, city experts select the appropriate score. They can also record here the source of information. So for example, if there is a city plan, they can include a link here, and it's very important to keep that for future reference. Then depending on the score, if, for example, the city has no plan, the planners can identify a set of actions that can be undertaken. For example, develop a new action plan for the city. And then they can assign the roles, institutional roles at the city level, who should be developing the action plan, and also the timeline for this action. Once this is done for all the essentials, you can consult the results of the scorecard by clicking on this button, which is at the top of the screen. And it is possible to view the overall result, or you can also access results for each of the 10 essentials individually. And the overall result score, for example, would look like this. So here the blue part is, this is what shows the score that the city reached. And the gray part around shows the maximum score. So the gray part really is the gap area where more efforts could be done by the city to strengthen resilience. And what's important to keep in mind also is that the scores are not meant to rate a city or compare it with other cities. The tool really serves to help a city to identify its own gaps and identify ways forward to become more resilient and address these gaps. So here are the examples of results analyzed by essential. And the reports can be downloaded if you would like to share them, for example, with other city representatives or with donors. They can be downloaded either as a PDF or as an Excel. And then once this is done, based on this information, the city can work on developing an action plan to address the identified gaps and needs. And there are different tools available to support such planning. So here I'm showing one simple template that can be used for that purpose, where you can, for example, once you've identified the actions to address the gaps that the scorecard identified, you can include them here in this table and then design some indicators to measure progress and the time frame, and also assign responsibilities. But currently UNDRR is also working on developing a new action guide, and this will provide more clear guidance on how to prioritize actions and develop projects based on the results of the scorecard. And ideally, the scorecard should be applied as part of a longer-term planning process involving different key stakeholders and also relying on available evidence and data. And a CT can, for example, organize several workshops to bring together these stakeholders, to fill the scorecard and to validate the results and then disseminate them. And the process is most effective when it is led by or endorsed by the mayor's office or the municipality council. The benefits of the scorecard go actually beyond the results and the scores, and it's really the conversations and the dialogue that result from this interaction and from the exercise of applying the scorecard that can generate even greater benefits. So this is really a helpful tool to also promote coherence across government at the local level and to ensure a more inclusive and comprehensive planning process. And there are different possible applications of the tool. So for example, a city can run the scorecard, use the preliminary assessment tool to develop a baseline assessment for the city, or it can go in depth into some specific topics through the detailed scorecard. A city can also focus just on a few essentials that are relevant to its context. And it can also, it's also possible to apply some of the scorecard thematic addenda to engage on specific thematic areas. And right now we have different types of scorecards. There is the preliminary assessment and the detailed assessment, which is the main tool. And we also have some thematic addenda that are available. One of them focuses on public health system resilience, another one on food systems. There is one for cultural heritage and one for including people with disabilities. And we are currently also finalizing a scorecard on displacement and another one on climate change. So these will be available later this year. Now I would like to move on very quickly to an exercise that will help you to understand a bit more the indicators that are used in the scorecard. Unfortunately, we don't have the time today to go through the tool in more detail, but hopefully this will help you to become a bit more familiar with this. So we will go through several examples for each of the essentials, and I invite you to join the Slido. Using your mobile phone, you can either use this QR code, or you can connect to slido.com and enter the code that you can see on the screen. So we have a few questions just to get to know you a little bit better. Which country are you from? And the next one is which city you are from. And after that, we will start looking at the indicators that are included in the scorecard. And I would like to invite you to think about them and answer the question based on your knowledge of your city's experience. So there is no right or wrong answer, and the objective of the exercise is not to compare between cities, but really for each of you individually to get an idea of the indicators and how they are scored and what it could mean to strengthen resilience in the context of your city. Very good. We have a lot of participants from the Philippines, also South Korea, Sri Lanka, Palestine. I will move on to the next question, which is about your city. Great. So let's take a look at the first question. This is from Essential 1, Organizing for Resilience. So please answer according to what you know about your city. So this question is about organization, coordination, and participation. Are there any multi-agency or multi-sectoral mechanisms in your city with the appropriate authority and resources to address disaster risk reduction? And the higher score here is 3. This is from the preliminary assessment. And this is when all lead agency teams are well established in the city and there are proper resources allocated to act across all DRR stages. And the lowest score is 0. If there is a lack of proper coordination mechanism and authority, or lack of resources to support such coordinated disaster risk reduction action. Okay, so we have 320 almost responses, and it looks like many of you live in cities where that score quite high in terms of this particular indicator, where all lead agency teams are well established and properly resourced and with authority to act, but there is some inconsistency in resourcing across the key DR stages. So in this case, if this is what you find during the application of the scorecard, one of the actions that could be recommended for the city is to try to address these inconsistencies or resourcing issues and improve these mechanisms even further. The next question is Essential 2, under Essential 2, which focuses on identifying risks and analyzing future risk scenarios as well. So here we have, I see there's a lot of action. It's very good. I'm glad you're participating so actively. Thank you very much for this. So this question is about cascading impacts, and if there is a collective understanding of possible cascading impacts in the city between the different infrastructure systems and under different scenarios. And this is going back to the presentation that Alf was making earlier, if you remember that infographic showing cascading impacts and risks. So here, once again, we have mostly cities that have a relatively complete understanding of cascading impacts under some disaster scenarios, but not necessarily all. And the lowest score possible is when there is no clear understanding of cascading impacts at the city level. So in case of, if the score is 0, then there is a clear action that can be implemented at the city level, which is to conduct more research and assessment of risks and cascading impacts at the city level, going through the different sectors and different systems of the city, different levels of infrastructure. So let's move on to the next question, which is related to Essential 3, which focuses on strengthening the financial capacity for resilience. Here we have an indicator that focuses on sources of funding and whether all the lead agencies are aware of all the different available sources of funding, how they are connected, and that they understand the ways of accessing external funding to support major investment in DRR. So once again, okay, we have a bit of a competition between score 1 and 2. So a lot of cities participating here are aware of the ways to secure funding for DRR and are actively pursuing these. So that is great. And many others understand some of the sources of funding, but the picture is still incomplete. And little is done to actually try to access these funds. So a possible action area for cities that score 1 on this question would be to conduct a better analysis of available funding sources, for example, and also to develop a strategy on how to access these funds. And this can be done with the support of, for example, under the MCR 2030 initiative, there are many partners that support cities in identifying sources of funding and developing bankable projects to access them. Moving on to Essential 4, which focuses on resilient urban development and design. So here a very important question of zoning and building codes and standards. Are they widely applied in your city and properly enforced and verified? So once again, our participants, many of our participants come from cities where the building codes are applied and enforced, but it looks like in this case, maybe there are more cities where the application of these codes is still partial or inconsistent. So here again, this clearly shows an example of action that can be undertaken by the cities to work towards strengthening the enforcement of the codes. Moving on to Essential 5, which focuses on ecosystem services and how they can serve as natural buffers to cities. So the question, the indicator here is the city aware of ecosystem services provided to the city? Are agreements in place with neighboring administrations to support the protection and management of transboundary natural assets? And it's interesting to see that there are quite a few cities that seem to be aware of the importance of natural capital beyond the borders, and also have some plans in place with neighboring administrations to protect these natural ecosystems. So that's very good, and nobody has replied, nobody has scored 0, which is also very positive in a way that clearly there is a greater understanding of the importance of natural ecosystems for disaster risk reduction. Moving on to Essential 6, so this is about the institutional capacity for resilience, and this indicator focuses on training delivery for government, businesses, NGOs, and community members on disaster risk and resilience. So here again, quite a few cities that provide training courses, but not necessarily to all sectors. So one of the action points possibly for cities that score 2 in this under this indicator would be to strengthen to further spread capacity development efforts across different sectors. Essential 7 focuses on understanding and strengthening societal capacity for resilience, so involving communities in the disaster risk reduction planning process and implementation. And here the indicator is about citizen engagement techniques and how effective the city is at engaging its population and communicating with it to involve people in disaster risk reduction action. So here again, we see quite a few positive examples of very participatory approaches and use of different media channels to involve the population. The Essential 8 focuses on increased infrastructure resilience. So another key area of resilience and disaster risk reduction governance at local level. Here the indicator focuses on healthcare, but the scorecard includes many other indicators under this essential that focus on other critical infrastructure. So again, we see that cities participating here today mostly have quite good preparedness at the level of the healthcare sector. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a dedicated thematic addendum to the scorecard that focuses specifically on the public health resilience. Now, Essential 9, which is about effective preparedness and disaster response, here the question focuses on early warning, which is a key component also of resilience. There is also a global call since 2022 to ensure that early warning systems are available for all. So it is really a major area of work for governments to implement. Here, for example, our participating cities estimate that over 75% of the population is reachable by early warning systems, which is good, but there's more progress that can be done. And we have about 18% of respondents who consider that in their city, less than half of the population is reachable by early warning systems. So this is also a clear gap area and an area to address in the city's action plan. And finally, moving on to the last essential, which is about expedite recovery and building back better. So here we focus on the lessons learned following a disaster, how well they are integrated in the planning and recovery process after a disaster happens. And here we see participants today find that they're in their cities. Some lessons are captured and disseminated, but not necessarily in a thorough or systematic way. So one of the possible action areas could be to improve that aspect of disaster risk reduction action in the city. So with this, I would like to thank you for your active participation. Unfortunately, we didn't have that much time today to focus on this in more detail. And as explained earlier, the objective here was really to introduce you to some of the indicators, and of course, the actual application of the scorecard should be done as part of a collective exercise, ideally using available data, scientific data, and should be part of a longer-term process as well, a collaborative one to develop a local DRR strategy and plan and build resilience. So because we're running a little bit late, I suggest that we move on actually to the next part, which is case studies from cities. And we will have a Q&A at the end of the two presentations. So I will take also some time to look at the questions that came during my presentation, and we can address them during that part. So now we would like you to have this opportunity to hear directly from two cities that have applied the scorecard. And we have invited today two guest speakers from Makati City in the Philippines and MCR 2030 Resilience Hub, and from Ulsan Metropolitan City, which is MCR 2030 Stage C city from the Republic of Korea. And they will share with you their hands-on experience in applying the scorecard to inform their city planning. So with that, I would like to invite Ms. Liza Ramos, please. So while she is connecting, let me introduce Ms. Liza Vele Ramos. So this presentation is from Makati City, which has been a champion in the MCR campaign for many years, and then was recognized in 2022 as an MCR 2030 Resilience Hub. And Makati City has many years of experience in applying and adapting the scorecard since its very development, and it has accumulated a wealth of good practices and lessons learned from other cities. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Ms. Liza Veli-Ramos, who is a licensed environmental planner. She has more than a decade of work in the field of disaster risk reduction and management, and also climate change adaptation. And she currently works for the city government of Makati as the research and planning division head of the city's disaster risk reduction and management office. So Liza, I cannot, yes, thank you. We have the presentation on, and I'm giving the floor to Liza, please.
Thank you so much, Dash. I hope everybody can hear me. Yeah, okay. So I can be heard. Okay, so as shared by Dash, we've been using the disaster resilience scorecard for quite some time already. And what I'm gonna present to you is how we've actually used it and applied it. No? So while Dash was actually sharing how the scorecard should be accomplished, I can see a lot of questions of how can this be applied? Who will be the third-party evaluator, etc., etc. So hopefully this presentation can somehow provide you an answer to some of your questions. No? But this is just basically a glimpse of the whole process on how it was basically applied in the local setup, in the city setup. So allow me to share with you our decade worth of journey or learning from the Making Cities Resilient campaign through this 2-minute audiovisual presentation. There you go. So our more than a decade of MCR journey has actually been summarized in just a 2-minute video. And I hope you were able to observe how we actually make use of the Making Cities Resilient tools on an annual basis. So yes, we have piloted its use during the launch of the Making Cities Resilient campaign in 2010. That was how many years ago? 13 years ago. And again, whatever tool was being developed for making cities resilient is actually being used by Makati. And as I've mentioned, it's used on an annual basis. No? So this is basically a summary of the different tools that we've been used throughout the years. And some of this actually has not been officially published. Like, for example, the Local Urban Indicators tool. It has been piloted in 2016 in Makati. And I think that the final version based on that pilot testing was already the Disaster Resilience Scorecard 2017. So next slide, please. In order for me to walk you through the journey of Makati, I'd like to start with the benefits of using the Disaster Resilience Scorecard. And based on our practice or experience, its benefits can actually be summarized into 3 key points. First is the use is for resilience building to is for the cities to ensure that resilient building must be data-driven and multi-stakeholder in approach. So the disaster resilience scorecard is actually a tool that ensures that whatever we put as our assessment is actually based on evidence and based on different perspectives of the different stakeholders. So later, as I walk you through again our journey, you will understand the importance of an evidence-based and multi-stakeholder approach in using the disaster resilience scorecard. Second is, in Makati, we were able to really make use of the results of the disaster resilience scorecard as our planning and monitoring guide. Later, you will also see how we've actually institutionalized the process and make it part of our strategic planning activity in the city. And lastly, again, since we've already signed up in the MCR 2030 and has been recognized as a resilience hub, we of course have that benefit to be updated with the different developments in the international arena when it comes to the Making Cities Resilient campaign, the tools, partnerships, and other developments. So it makes us, keep our interventions updated and relevant, not only in building the resilience of our city, but also contributing to international agenda. Next slide, please. So let me go through these three main benefits that I've shared with you, and how this were actually manifested in how we applied the disaster resilience scorecard. First is this institutionalized process of being evidence-based and using the multi-stakeholder approach. The disaster resilience scorecard has prescribed a process on how we can actually make use of it, what are the considerations in planning for disaster resilience, etc. But in Makati, we actually tried to break that down in a little bit in more detail. So for instance, there's this preparatory phase in accomplishing the disaster resilience scorecard. So what we did in the preparatory phase is to have, time or period to really identify the most appropriate stakeholder for where we can actually get the data or the evidence that this specific indicators are requiring. And this stakeholder identification phase, or the identification of stakeholder, does not only cover stakeholders within the city government. We also identified stakeholders external to the city government, mainly the private sector and even civil society organizations. Next is our desk review. So we did a lot of reviews, or like in-depth review of the indicators, just to set the parameters. Is this how we want to define it? While the disaster resilience scorecard toolkit actually has this prescribed definition, the parameters to take into consideration, we still contextualized and localized it into our own local setting. And then there comes the actual data gathering. So in the disaster resilience scorecard toolkit, the prescription is just to make sure that the assessment must be done with different stakeholders. In our case, again, just to have a little bit more of details in terms of data and evidence, we also did key informant interview. So that's basically the idea. So there's this general prescription, but it's up to the city government, or it's up to the local government on how they would want to contextualize it based on your needs. And lastly, of course, the assessment is just an assessment, but planning and processing based on the result of the assessment is another phase. So in our case, we dedicated a team to process the result of the multi-stakeholder workshops and then use it as part of our disaster resilience planning. So in the Philippines, I see that there are a lot of Philippine participants here. So you must know this process. that in the Philippines, or this provision in the Philippines, that all of the local governments are required to have their local disaster risk reduction and management plan. So we're all required, and we're fortunate that our national law also requires the creation of a permanent office dedicated for disaster risk reduction and management. So it was actually a little bit easy, relatively easier for us to have a dedicated team to process and use the results of the multi-stakeholder workshops for our planning purposes. Next slide. So for the next slide, I think it's also still about using the tool as as an evidence-based multi-stakeholder planning tool. So basically, again, during the course of our application of the disaster resilience scorecard, there were trial and error on how we'd like to approach and identify the different stakeholders that should be able to provide us the right data and evidence for each indicator. So what we did, like for example, in 2014, we gathered all the city government offices and departments based on the indicator. Like on a per indicator basis, we are actually taking note of the specific office or department within the city government who most likely have these kinds of intervention and data. And here is a summary. Here's the result of the 2014 disaster resilience scorecard assessment. And you will see at that time, the scoring is still 1 to 5, 5 being the highest. So if you will notice, we're already, Makati being a highly urbanized city, and maybe one of the most active cities when it comes to disaster resilience building. Out of 5, we just averaged 2.93 across the 10 essentials. Imagine that. But next slide, please. A year after, what we did is to also engage the private sector and have them answer the same 10 essentials. Only that, of course, some of the essentials are not applicable to them, to their services. So we invited the energy sector, water and food sector, telecommunication sector, the developers, and we were able to get their consensus. Imagine competitors, for example, of the telecommunication services sit in one table and discuss what is our status in Makati in terms of these 10 essentials, no? So we were able to get their responses, and you can see on the slide this response. Next slide, please. So from the 2.93 average of the city government in 2014, when we actually considered the perspective of the private sector, 2.93 went up to 3.4. So what's the point of this? No, again, Dasha explained earlier that numbers are just numbers. It's actually not the main point of the scorecard, but it's how you would address the gap, and how would you come up with certain strategies. No, but in this case, it just shows that the city government interventions alone cannot actually make us meet the overall resilience goal of the city. We need different stakeholders. And that's the beauty of ensuring that there are multi-stakeholder participation when we do our workshops for disaster resilience scorecard. Next slide, please. Here on this slide is a learning on planning and monitoring guide. No, so again, from those annual assessment, this one is the version where we conducted it in 2017. So you will see that again the average is 2.57. But the point here is that from the 2017 assessment, it was very timely for us at that time, because we were in the process of updating our local disaster risk reduction and management plan. And because of our years of application or use of the disaster resilience scorecard, you were able to actually institutionalize the process. In the next slide, I will walk you through that institutionalization. But again, here on a per essential basis to address the gaps, we were able to really identify priority programs that are actually reflected in our disaster risk reduction and management plan 2019 to 2030. And this is really no joke. If you search in the Makati portal and look for the Makati DRRM plan, you will see this at the priority programs of the city. Okay, next slide. So here is basically the process, no? So aside from planning, remember in the earlier slides, we said that the last step is planning. Now we also want to make sure that we monitor it, no? So in terms of the process, again, the Philippine cities here may actually be very familiar with this process. We are being required to submit a lot of monitoring reports on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, on a 3-year basis. And all of this, I mean, basically the accomplishment of the disaster resilience scorecard has been institutionalized or incorporated in these outcome monitoring reports that we are required to submit. So whatever gaps that have been identified, accomplishments that have been identified, we formulate our programs, projects, and activities, and this becomes our reference for the annual investment program. So the funding side of the use of the disaster resilience scorecard. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's about the institutionalization. Now, on the benefit of it, in terms of being abreast to the international developments, earlier there was one of the references that Dasha shared with you is the public health addendum. So the public health addendum, it's basically an addendum to the disaster resilience scorecard, which is also anchored on the 10 essentials, only that this is in the perspective of public health. So since we've been using the disaster resilience scorecard, and when we saw that there is this updated tool or this addendum, and this happened during the pandemic, so we were able to make use of this public health addendum in 2020. That was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of our familiarity with the disaster resilience scorecard tool, we were able to actually make use of the same process, make use of the same stakeholder identification, etc., etc. And through this, the public health addendum has 115 indicators, and we were able to get a total score of 89 out of the 115 indicators. And because of this, we were able to craft the disaster risk reduction and management on health plan of the city. So again, there's this long-term strategic planning, and at the same time, through your engagement in the MCR campaign and the disaster resilience scorecard accomplishment, you'll also benefit from getting different updated tools that you can use for your sectoral plan. No, and public health addendum is one evidence for that. Next slide, please. I think I do not have enough time, so let me I think this is my last slide. Okay, so just to summarize our learnings, a decade worth of learnings in the accomplishment or in the use of the disaster resilience scorecard, I would just like to really emphasize these two main points. I know that you know this already, but the disaster resilience scorecard helped us realize that these are just not buzzwords. These are not just phrases that we wanna use just to sound that we are resilient enough as a city. But these are really phrases that we really need to embrace and imbibe in order for us to really make sure that our disaster resilience strategies are really relevant and appropriate to the needs of our cities. Okay, so the first one is, of course, mainstreaming of DRRM in the different sectors, in the different policies, and even investment programming. And this requires multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approach in resilience assessment and planning. And of course, let's continue that to monitoring and evaluation so that we can complete the whole cycle of planning. And again, in our case, while the idea of the disaster resilience scorecard is just to identify for us to help for us to be aided in identifying strategies, what we did is to again go beyond that, and these strategies now to be converted into programs. So to make it more strategic, no, so long-term programs. And it's very, very useful if we institutionalize the use of this disaster resilience scorecard and the Making Cities Resilient tools in our planning process. Whatever is the planning process of your city, find a way, try to find a way to institutionalize the use of the disaster resilience scorecard and the other Making Cities Resilient tools, so that it will not be your stakeholders will not feel that this is an added burden to them, because realistically speaking, it requires a lot of time, a lot of data gathering. So it would be very useful for all cities to institutionalize this process. And the second point is that really resilience is everybody's business, which actually is manifested basically on how I presented the change in results of our 2014 and 2015 assessment when we factored in the private sector perspective in accomplishing the 10 essentials. No, so let us really get that idea that a city is a system of systems. No, whatever interventions we do as a city, it may not be enough for us to be able to really build our resilience. We need the different stakeholders, and for us to be very true to ourselves. Even, for example, the self-assessment, this disaster resilience scorecard is actually a self-assessment, no, with the varying perspectives from different stakeholders. At least we can have that balancing feels, that whatever we put in as our accomplishments there is actually based on evidence, based on how the different stakeholders are actually approaching a specific prescribed intervention or indicator. I think this is my last slide. So, and well, the last slide really is just a thank you and just a reminder that it's really up to us on how we can make disaster resilience a way of life in our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear Liza, for this very inspiring presentation and excellent example from Makati City, which I hope has also answered many of the questions that were in the room before and provided a useful example from a real-life experience in applying the tool for city planning. So now I would like to move on to the next presentation from Ulsan Metropolitan City in the Republic of Korea. And Ulsan is a very active member of MCR 2030 and has also been applying the scorecard to inform its planning for some time now. And currently the city is also working with the Korean government on adapting the tool to the Korean context and also developing a handbook for Korean local governments on using the scorecard. So I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest speaker, Mr. Yoon Yong-bae, who is the Chief of Disaster Management Research Center at the Ulsan Research Institute. And Mr. Yoon has been working at the Ulsan Research Institute since 2011 and holds a PhD in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Ulsan, with a focus on water resources engineering. So Mr. Yoon, the floor is yours. If you can please share your presentation.
I would like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak at today's international workshop. I'm looking forward to a conductive and informative time with all the parties. I'm sorry. Before I begin, I would like to apologize, as English is my first language. It's not my first language, and my expression may not be fluent or accurate. However, I'll do my best to convey my message as clearly as possible. Hello, everyone. My name is Yong-bae Yoon, and I'm a research fellow at the Ulsan Research Institute. focusing on urban disaster risk reduction and management for urban safety. Today, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present to you the Ulsan City Scorecard Workshop and Ulsan's steadfast commitment to the Resilience Hub. Moving on to the second slide, let me give you a brief introduction to Ulsan City. Ulsan is a metropolitan city located in southeastern part of South Korea, bordered by Gyeongsangnam-do, Gyeongsangbuk-do, and Busan metropolitan city. With a population of approximately 1.1 million, it is one of the 7 largest cities in Korea. Ulsan is also well known as the epicenter of the 3 major industries, petrochemicals, shipbuilding, and automobile manufacturing. And it is home to various advanced manufacturing industries and small and medium-sized enterprises. Despite Ulsan City's impressive growth and development, rapid industrialization has also given rise to various environmental and safety issues that needs to be addressed. The city has been facing persistent environmental problems such as air and water pollution, as well as 4 others. Additionally, safety concerns such as chemical leaks, explosions, typhoons, earthquakes, and other disasters have also been occurring in the city. On this slide, I would like to talk about Ulsan City's challenge in addressing these problems. The first challenge was the transformation from a small fishing village to the industrial capital of South Korea through rapid industrialization. The second challenge was to overcome environmental problems caused by industrialization. The Taewa River, once known as the River of Death, has been transformed into an ecological river where the salmon return, and air quality has also dramatically improved. The final third challenge is to ensure urban safety, which has been a top priority for Ulsan City. In this regard, the scorecard workshop we are discussing today is an essential step toward achieving this goal. In the following slides, I will present the various efforts and achievements by Ulsan to prepare for various risks and create a safe city. Since 2018, an annual self-assessment on disaster risk reduction has been conducted in Ulsan, known as the Scorecard Workshop, which consists of 4 stages. The first stage is to form an assessment team, which includes experts in disaster management, citizen groups, and local government officials to establish an effective self-assessment team. The second stage is providing pre-assessment information to the assessment team, including information on the current status of disaster risk reduction in Ulsan, related laws and policies and strategies. The third stage is scorecard assessment, where the assessment team evaluates the overall disaster risk reduction in Ulsan by utilizing scorecards. Through this process, problems are identified and improvement plans are developed. Lastly, the fourth stage is the utilization of assessment results to establish policies and strategies for improvement and to execute them effectively. Through the scorecard workshop, Ulsan City continuously improves its disaster risk reduction capability by conducting regular self-assessment and making necessary improvements. Let me now provide an overview of each stage of the scorecard workshop. In the first stage, the assessment team for the scorecard workshop is formed. This team is composed of relevant departments, organizations, citizen groups, and experts in Ulsan City, in accordance with the 10 essentials proposed by UNDRR. Typically, each team consists of 7 to 8 members, and a total of 4 assessment teams are formed. UNDRR ONEA GETI is responsible for providing training for the assessment teams, while Ulsan Research Institute oversees the overall progress of the workshop. Moving on to the second stage, the scorecard tool and information on Ulsan City's 10 essentials are provided in advance to the assessment team. This aims to enhance the effectiveness of the assessment process and enable the team to conduct a more accurate and systematic assessment by enabling them to study and analyze this information prior to the workshop. UNDRR, ONEA GETI, and Ulsan Research Institute collaborate to provide this information. During the third stage, a scorecard assessment is conducted. This progress takes place over a period of 2 days, with participation from the assessment team, education team, and operation team. The scorecard assessment consists of 5 steps. In step 1, the UNDRR ONEA GETI provides education to the assessment team on MCR 2030, the Sendai framework, disaster and risk, and scorecard assessment indicators. In step 2, each assessment team discusses the scorecard assessment indicators. The 4 assessment team engage in discussion and decide on the level of resilience of Ulsan City for each assessment indicators. In step 3, a representative from one of the assessment teams explains the results. They describe in detail how the team came to their scores for each assessment indicator through discussion within their team. In step 4, the 4 assessment teams discuss their different results. The team that presented different results explains their discussion process and the process of determining the level of resilience for Ulsan City is agreed upon by all assessment teams. In step 5, the result for all the determined indicators are summarized and confirmed. This process promotes mutual learning and understanding among the involved parties and formed a shared understanding. The fourth stage involves identifying improvement policies based on the results of the scorecard assessment, which is a comprehensive process of analyzing the assessment results and setting priorities for developing improvement policies in collaboration with each department and experts. The improvement policy identified through this process will greatly enhance Ulsan's capacity to reduce disaster risks. As part of the scorecard assessment process, excellent cases of Ulsan cities are also collected and summarized. These best practices of Ulsan City are expected to greatly contribute to preparing for and responding to future disasters. The title Moving Forward conveys Ulsan City's dedication to continuous growth and development. Ulsan City is continuously accumulating data on resilience, disaster risk, and citizen awareness, and making efforts to increase public understanding of disaster and develop resilience strategies. Through these efforts, Ulsan City aims to become a more prepared and secure place to live. Ulsan City is devoted to promoting sustainability in MCR 2030 through ongoing exchange and cooperation. Furthermore, Ulsan City prioritizes the safety of its citizens by promoting education and disaster preparedness, as well as continuously conducting resilience assessments through the scorecard. By doing so, Ulsan City will working toward become a resilience hub. Thank you for listening to the presentation. Since English is not my first language, answering questions on the spot may be difficult for me. Therefore, if possible, I request that questions be sent to me via email so that I can provide more accurate and detailed answer. Once again, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yoon, for this very helpful presentation. It was very interesting to hear from Ulsan's example. And we really appreciate you also making the effort to make the presentation in English, which is very good, by the way. So thank you for that. I note your request to submit questions to you via email, and I see there was at least one question to Ulsan City which focused on what kind of data and research strategies Ulsan uses to inform its disaster resilience plans. So if the participant who asked that question could please send an email to Dr. Yoon in order to get a more detailed reply. I would be grateful for that. So thank you very much once again, Dr. Yoon. We have quite a few questions in the chat, and I've been trying to keep up with all of them and summarize them. So maybe going back to some of the basics, because there were a few questions related to my presentation that I wanted to clarify, and perhaps also to make it a bit quicker, I would like to invite you. I posted several links in the chat where you can find more information about the scorecard and about the MCR 2030 initiative. Both websites are very comprehensive, so I think many of the questions that you asked, you will find some answers to them in on these websites. But basically, to clarify on regarding MCR 2030 participation, there was one question on the criteria for cities to join the MCR. The criterion is that the city has to be committed to resilience and to disaster risk reduction. And the commitment must be made at the higher level. So most cities will be required to submit a letter of commitment signed by the mayor. But apart from that, there are no other limitations. Any city, any municipality as well, that's another question. It isn't just the cities, it's also any local governments who are interested to participate, whether municipalities, towns, they can also join, but as a consulted, endorsed process by the local government. And there is no limitation on the size of city or any additional criteria, just this commitment to resilience. Some other questions were answered in the chat. I think I will transfer some of them also to Liza from Makati based on her hands-on experience also with applying the scorecard and also as a resilience hub in the MCR 2030 initiative. Some questions about the scorecard on who can fill the assessment. So as presented in earlier, this should be a collaborative process that is led by the local government, and if possible, engaging as many stakeholders as possible. That can be non-governmental, they can be community level, civil society actors, academia, also the private sector. But the process must be led by the local government. Also the question of the scorecard, whether it applies to municipalities or just cities, this is the same. Any local government is welcome to apply it. In some cases, for example, in Mongolia, we have seen that the scorecard has been applied at the district level of one city, and then the scores have been accumulated to produce a city level assessment. So that is also possible. So really, this should be used as a useful tool for the city, and it can be adapted in any way. So, for example, Ulsan City is now looking at adapting the scorecard to the Korean context, and we've seen also other examples from other countries and cities that have adjusted the tool, translated it into different languages, so really localized it. And this is a key element of making this tool useful, is to be able to actually adapt it to the needs of a city. So you can use it the way you want. You can focus just on a few indicators. You can skip indicators that are not relevant to the context of your city. So there are really many ways of using it, and it should be seen as a very flexible tool that primarily aims to support, to give one example of how cities can go about their resilience assessment and planning. So some questions that were specifically directed to Makati City. I think some of them were very specific to Makati's support to other cities. And I saw that Eliza provided her office's contacts at the end of her presentation. So I would suggest that those cities that are looking for specific support from Makati or concrete questions also direct them to Makati City directly. And here I would like to raise some common questions that were coming up regarding the process of applying the scorecard, and that I would like to ask Liza also to help respond. So one recurrent question was about getting the authority and national government support in applying the scorecard and the resources to actually conduct the exercise. So perhaps, Liza, would you be able to share additional insights on that? How much the national government has been involved, and if you had any extra financial budget to support the initiative? And also, there are some questions about additional participation of the private sector in the process and public-private partnerships in conducting the exercise. So if you could please help to provide an overview of these aspects, it would be
Sure,
great.
sure. Okay, So, well, basically, when we engaged ourselves, or when Makati engaged in the Making Cities Resilient campaign, mainly with the idea of the local government, being active in or being at the forefront of this initiative. It's purely an initiative of the city. So we weren't really able to get, for example, support in terms of resources, may it be human, may it be financial, from the national government. But there are specific indicators that, depending on the context again of your city or municipality, would require data from higher level authority. Like, for example, under the essential on natural ecosystem, there are questions on transboundary concerns and transboundary agreements, and that would require getting data or information from, in our case, the Metro Manila Development Council. So perhaps in your context, it can be directly up to the national government already. So, but basically, this is a purely local government initiative. And again, national or regional governments are data sources. They acted as data sources in our case. Now, as for private sector initiative, remember during in my slide on the process on how we actually applied or make use of the disaster resilience scorecard, there is this process on key informant interview. There's this step. And that key informant interview actually was dedicated to the private sector, mainly because I think this will also answer one of the questions about the challenges, because it is really difficult to get data from the private sector because they're always insisting on the confidentiality clauses of their plans. So that's actually a challenge. So understanding that there is this confidentiality concern that we have to address, and with that eagerness to really make sure that we get the perspective of the private sector, we went to them one by one. I mean, like literally go to their office, make an appointment, go to their office, talk to their legal officer, talk to their business continuity managers, and try to discuss, why are we doing this? Why do we need your data? Because that's always the question. Why do you need our data? And also with that difficulty in, putting the competitors in one table, we have to really explain to them that, okay, if this is the limitations of your disclosure of whatever data you have, at least let us know if you have, measures. Because the disaster resilience scorecard sometimes asks about the number of days that a particular service, for example, water service, will be disrupted. Or for example, the telecommunication service will be disrupted. And in the Philippines, we have two major telecommunication providers that, of course, since they are competitors, they would not want to disclose their business continuity strategies with each other. So in that key informant interview step, we tried to somehow set the expectation, level off, so that during the actual workshop, it's easier now for them to disclose whatever is allowed by their legal office to be disclosed. So we really exerted extra effort to get them on board. That's for private sector involvement. And then for the authority, as I've said earlier, we're fortunate in the Philippines that we do have a permanent DRRM, or Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, per local government, and also the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, composed of the different departments and offices with representation from the civil society organization and private sector. So just by convening the DRRM Council, we can already ensure that whatever activity we'll do, it's going to be a multi-stakeholder activity. So again, because our national law has provided for that, and again, it's in terms of like there's really a need for institutional commitment to really engage in these kinds of work, because it cannot be just, you know, a one-time big time activity. You may lose a lot of opportunities by just doing it one time. There, and in terms of resources, just to answer this very quickly, the only maybe in terms of financial resources, it's just the expense for the workshops. Just the expense for the workshops. Of course, for the actual implementation of the strategies based on the programs that you have identified, that's another story. But if it's just in the accomplishment of the disaster resilience scorecard, it's just the workshop expenses and the time and effort to really go to the different stakeholders and make sure that they will take part in the activities for accomplishment of the disaster resilience scorecard.
Thank you very much, Liza. And because we don't have that much time, maybe I can ask you one last question. As a local government representative, what would be your advice for individual advocates or civil society groups who are wishing to join the process or encourage their governments to engage in this process? Some of the questions we received came from cities where the local government, for example, wasn't necessarily focusing much on disaster risk, and they were asking how, you know, from the grassroots level, could they try to encourage their government to join the process? Any advice?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure if this is the right answer to that, but in every opportunity where I can share how resilience building can actually be a success, it's always about I always share that we need to look for champions. We need to look for champions, whether it's at the city level or at the grassroots level. And it's always about relationship building. So for the civil society organization and non-government organizations, and even the academe, would like to take part on this initiative and encourage their cities or municipalities to be involved in this initiative, your relationship must be built first. There must be, you know, trust and confidence in how you do your work, and then you can act as a facilitator for these kinds of activities. Like there can be, you know, a mutual partnership or a mutual exchange on how you can help, and at the same time how your particular NGO or CSO can actually benefit from this exercise. No, so it's actually hard to, you know, have a direct answer on how you can help and how you can encourage your cities. At the end of the day, again, it's about relationship building, trust building, and looking for that champion who can influence particularly your cities and municipalities to be part of this.
Thank you very much, Liza. Maybe also to complement this a little bit from UNDRR side, I would also like to encourage those participants who have asked questions about grassroots participation. There is the prevention web community of UNDRR that you are welcome to join as individual experts or citizens interested in disaster risk reduction, which will give access to many tools and communities of practice. So that could be one way also of learning from others and also sharing your own perspectives. And the UNDRR also engages with non-governmental stakeholders and promotes the participation of the civil society and citizens and youth in support of the implementation of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So there are also channels to participate through there, and I will share some links as well with you at the end of the presentation. I think there were many other questions asked, for example, whether DR can be applied to infrastructure development planning rather than assessing risks of existing infrastructure. So this can also be done through different risk assessment tools. The scorecard, really what it does is that it helps to assess levels of resilience, but it doesn't necessarily go disaster by disaster or hazard by hazard. There are other tools to support risk assessment in that way that are available through the MCR 2030 platform and from the different partners who are supporting the MCR. So once again, I would like to encourage you to have a look at the links. Unfortunately, yes, the MCR 2030 dashboard is a closed platform that is only available for the users, so for CT, local governments, and for participating agencies. But for example, through the Prevention Web community, there are many tools that you can access without being a member of the MCR, and these also offer some specific diagnostic tools that, that can be accessed. So I think with that, we need to move on to the final part of this session today. And I would like to thank the audience for your really excellent questions and attention also. It is very, we're very glad to see so much interest in these topics and also the positive feedback. So thank you very much for that. And I would also like to thank, of course, our excellent presenters and guest speakers who shared their very insightful experiences from Makati City and from Ulsan. And I think these were really inspiring examples of how to effectively use the scorecard to identify resilience gaps and the needs of cities. So the next part is an interactive quiz, which will allow you to review some of the key concepts and points that we looked at throughout this session. This will require you once again to join through Slido. I will put the presentation up in just a second. Okay. So here we are. Once again, please use your mobile phones or connect through your laptops by using this QR code or typing in slido.com and the code UNDRR to join the quiz. Please use the Slido application or website to answer the questions, so there is no need to post them in the chat. You can just use the Great. I will just let 30 seconds for everybody to join. So this is just to reassure you, this is not, this is more like an exercise to help you to review some of the concepts that we examined today. This is not part of the requirements for certification. So if you have trouble joining right now, don't worry about it. What is key in order to obtain the certificate is to fill the pre-workshop assessment and the post-workshop assessments, as well as the daily attendance sheets that my colleagues have been posting and sharing with you in the chat. And this is more like a fun exercise to close the session. So let us start already with the first question. True or false? Disasters are a natural phenomenon and the impacts are beyond human control. Please select your answer. I'll let a couple of seconds to give an opportunity for everybody to reply. Okay, so what do we have? So most of you, 72% have answered false, 28% have answered true, and the correct answer is false. And that is because disasters are not a natural phenomenon. Hazards can be, but disasters are a combination of exposure and vulnerability and hazards and the decisions that we as a society make in terms of where we live, where we construct, where our assets are. So the correct answer was false. Next question is, if your city is resilient, it can withstand and recover from the impact of disasters and stress of other shocks and stresses in a short period of time. Is that true or false? Okay, let us see. We have 91%, the majority answering true. 9% have answered false. And the correct answer is true. So a disaster resilient city is a city that has developed the capacity to withstand the effects of disasters and understand the risks and to mitigate them. And the more a city is resilient, the less will be the impacts that they face, and the faster also the recovery from a disaster will be. So let us look at the next question. Poor urban and local governance, ecosystem decline, climate change, vulnerable livelihoods are an example of drivers of risk. True or false? Okay, let us see what we have. Good, 97% answered true, 3% false, and the correct answer is true. And this is because there are many different social, economic, and environmental factors that can increase disaster risks. And this can be, for example, uneven economic or urban development, climate change, weak governance, poor urban governance as well. So really, poverty can also be one of the drivers. So it's really not just about the hazard, but all these different social, economic circumstances and political circumstances around it. The next question is, the only department concerned with the reduction of risks is the Emergency Management Department. Is that true or false? Okay, let's see, 98% false, 2% true. Very well done for those who have replied false, because that is the correct answer. As we explained in the presentations, risk is everybody's business, and disaster risk reduction should be done through a process that goes across the different levels of governance and types of stakeholders. So it's not just the Emergency Management Department, but cities as a whole, society as a whole, that should be concerned with the reduction of risks. Question number 5. Poverty is a socioeconomic issue which has no relation to the impact of a disaster. True or false? Okay, I think that one was actually quite easy because we just touched upon it. 96% false, and that is correct. So poverty and other socioeconomic issues, of course, affect the vulnerability of populations, and this leads to greater risk of hazards becoming a disaster. And actually, the poorest populations are often the ones that are most affected by disasters and climate change impacts. And that is regardless of whether they are in developing or developed countries. So, and this is due to their limited capacity, financial capacity to protect themselves against the hazards and to cope with the aftermath also and reconstruct and recover. So question number 6, using natural ecosystems to reduce disaster risk and enhance city protection is one of the essentials for making cities resilient. True or false? Okay, 99% true. That is correct. Protecting and safeguarding natural buffers to enhance the protective functions of ecosystems is one of the essentials of among the 10 essentials. It's essential 5. And indeed, as we saw earlier, using natural ecosystems and protecting them can really help a city to reduce risk in a more sustainable way. Question number 7. The scorecard can help to understand the status of resilience and the gaps in risk reduction. Is that true or false? Sorry, actually, I might have closed them. Can you please submit your answers? Yes, thank you. Okay, let's see. True, 99%. We still have 1% who doesn't think so. But the scorecard, which is structured around the 10 essentials, aims to help cities to understand the status across different sectors and enhance their resilience. So that was true. Question number 8, building consensus and working relationships between the different sectors and departments in the government is not an objective of the scorecard. True or false? Okay, 95% false, and that is correct. So as we mentioned, and I hope you also understood from the presentations from Makati and Ulsan, that the benefits are really beyond the scoring and then the reporting. It's really the dialogue and the conversation across different stakeholders that is very beneficial as part of the scorecard application and planning. Question number 9, resilience is a long-term investment. Even if the city scores high in the scorecard today, the situation may change in the future. Is that true or false? Oh, wow, 100%. Excellent. So that was correct. It is true that resilience building is a long-term process. And risks can change anytime. We live in a very uncertain time and very complex systems. So it is very important for cities and local governments and national governments to constantly reassess their risks and their plans for disaster risk reduction. And even if using the scorecard, they score high today, tomorrow can be a completely different situation because new risks arise, especially with climate change. So it is important to continue monitoring and reviewing plans. And the final question is, the use of the scorecard is a key step towards developing a local DR action plan. True or false? Okay, let us see. 99% true. 1% considers that this is not the case, but the correct answer in this case is that it's true. At least the scorecard is intended to help cities and municipalities to develop their local DR action plans by identifying gaps and then designing actions to respond to them. So let us see. Oh, we have a winner. Congratulations. Congratulations to you all, not just the winner. I see a lot of people have gotten all the responses correctly. So well done. And I hope that you found this useful. So with that, we are moving into the end of our session today. And just as a recap of the session and before closing today, I would like to also share with you some key lessons from what we saw today. Just a second as I close one presentation and move to the other. So we hope that you found this session useful overall. And what we hoped to achieve today was to really help you to understand some of the key concepts around risk and resilience and hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and that disaster risk is really a combination of all of these elements. Also, we learned that disasters are not natural and they are the result of the choices that we make as to where we live, where we build, how we protect and we support people and livelihoods. We also learned about some of the key global frameworks for resilience and disaster risk reduction, in particular the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. Its links with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement, and how they all contribute to the overall goal of achieving risk-informed sustainable development, and where resilience is central. And we also introduced the MCR 2030 initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative to support municipalities and connect them with different partners that can provide services and technical expertise to help them progress on a resilience roadmap. We learned about the resilience roadmap as a normative framework that can guide cities towards long-term resilience. We also looked into the disaster resilience scorecard for cities, which is a key tool to support local governments in assessing resilience needs and gaps and developing evidence-based resilience strategies. We also practiced a little bit understanding some of the indicators. So all of the links have been shared with you, and we will also continue to share the material from this presentation with you. And finally, we also learned, very importantly, from two cities, Makati in the Philippines and Ulsan in Korea, about their experience in applying the scorecard and how they used the results to inform their city planning, but also how they adapted the tool and the process to their local context and needs. So all these materials and presentations, and also the links we shared in the chat, will be made available to all of you through a shared online folder, and I think my colleagues have shared already the link with you. I would also like to encourage you to continue looking at all these resources and tools after the workshop. They are all available online, and UNDRR and all our partners will also be glad to support cities and other local governments and national governments in applying these tools. Or if you have any questions or further assistance, you will also have our contacts there in the presentations. And if you are a city that is a member of the MCR 2030, then we highly encourage you to reach out to other cities to learn from their experience and ask for advice, especially from the resilience hubs, on how to practically apply tools and learn from their experience. So finally, I would like to remind once again of the requirements of obtaining the certificate for this course. Certificates will be given to those participants who attend all of the 3 sessions of the course. So please make sure that you have registered your name and your email in the daily attendance form that was circulated. And also participants must complete the pre-workshop assessment, which was shared with you in an email earlier, and you have until today to complete it. And also the post-workshop assessment, which will be shared with you at the end of the final session of the workshop. And with that, I would like to warmly thank once again all our speakers, Alf Blicker from UNDRR, Liza Ramos from Makati City, and Yoon Young-bae from Ulsan Research Institute, and also our co-organizers and co-hosts at UNPOG and UNITAR, CIFAL Jeju, particularly those colleagues who were actively supporting this session behind the scenes. So thank you very much. And a big thank you to all of you, our dear participants, for your active participation, all the interest, all the questions. Thank you for that. And with that, I would like to close the first session and invite Mr. Samuel Dana from UNPOG to introduce you to the program of the second session of the course, which will take place this Thursday. So thank you, and
thank
Dana,
you very
the
much,
floor is yours.
Asha, for such a wonderful moderation, and to the speakers and especially the participants for their wonderful and exciting engagement. We really appreciate that. I want to quickly introduce the session for next week on Thursday. So the next session begins at 2 p.m. Korea time on Thursday, and it's a continuation of today's session, and it's going to be on risk-informed sustainable development. How do we accelerate resilience in cities and local communities through digital government innovation? So we're going to have a set of presentations. We're also going to have invited speakers from other institutions coming in, especially apart from talking on risk-informed governance, risk-informed sustainable development. We're also going to look at how we leverage innovative technologies to be able to build resilient, smart, and inclusive societies. There will be presentations on how we use science for early warning systems, and we look also at an important aspect of building resilience. That is, how do we ensure we have infrastructure asset management? We're going to have other engaging sessions on how we're going to look at being able to put this into practice. So it's another way. So the session is going to focus on the fundamental knowledge on these concepts, as well as highlighting some of the insights on the significant role of risk-informed governance, innovative technologies, disaster risk reduction, infrastructure asset management. So this sums up what we expect to see next week. And we will really want to thank you once again for your active engagement, and we are excited and looking forward to having you next week. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, and see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.
No, not you.